On the surface, November 18th, 2010 looked like a normal Thursday morning in suburban Atlanta. The sky was clear, the air calm, and families were caught up in their usual morning routines, preparing lunches and hurrying to drop the kids off at school. In the Sneiderman household, Rusty Sneiderman was doing just that. After breakfast with his family, he kissed his wife goodbye, loaded his 2-year-old son Ian into the car, buckled him in, and drove to Dunwoody Prep, a small daycare center in a safe, middle-class neighborhood. Rusty, 36 years old, is a Harvard graduate entrepreneur. He has built a stable and successful life for his wife, Andrea, and their 2 children, Ian and Sophia. Friends described him as charming, loyal, energetic, and endlessly optimistic. He took great pride in his role as a father, always present and enthusiastic in caring for his children. But as he walked Ian into daycare that morning, an unseen danger was stalking him after dropping Ian off and exchanging pleasantries with other parents. Rusty made his way back to his car. Suddenly, the quiet morning shattered. A man emerged, raised a gun, and fired 3 shots at close range. One bullet struck Rusty in the neck, and he collapsed onto the asphalt as horrified parents and teachers froze in shock. Blood surrounded him as he lay motionless. He didn't scream or struggle. It was an abrupt, calculated killing. The shooter then calmly walked back to his silver van and drove away. Rusty died instantly, just steps from the daycare playground. Close enough for the children to hear, but his son Ian remained inside, safe and unaware that he'd just said goodbye to his father for the last time. The city of Dunwoody was in shock. Who would carry out such a bold and brutal murder in broad daylight? In front of children, and why? Who could want Rusty dead? As investigators delved into Rusty's life, they uncovered a web of secrets darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. It was a story entangled with infidelity, manipulation, obsession, and ultimately, murder. The truth unveiled a world where appearances were deceiving and no one could be trusted. Rusty Sneiderman was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a close-knit, loving Jewish family. From an early age, he was marked by charm, humor, and kindness. As the youngest in his family, Rusty grew up surrounded by love, high expectations, and strong traditions. He thrived academically, but his greatest gift was the way he made others feel valued and understood. By his teenage years, Rusty had developed a knack for leadership. He organized school events, volunteered, and built enduring friendships. Success wasn't his sole pursuit. He earned respect through his compassion and determination. After graduating high school, Rusty went on to Indiana University, where he formed a lifelong bond with Josh Gollum, one of his closest friends. It was during these college years that Rusty's life took a defining turn. One evening, after a relaxing night out, Rusty meets a wonderful girl, Andrea Robin Greenberg. She is smart, ambitious, and very beautiful, and Rusty is instantly attracted to her. Their bond was intense from the start. Their relationship deepened quickly, with friends noting how hard and fast Rusty had fallen for her. After graduating, Rusty pursued an MBA at Harvard Business School, one of the most prestigious programs in the nation. He worked relentlessly, motivated by his dream of building a stable and meaningful life for his future family. After earning his degree, he married Andrea, and they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, to create the life they had long envisioned. Rusty embarked on a career in finance, eventually becoming a trusted wealth manager and business consultant. His clients valued his expertise, and his colleagues respected him. Rusty approached his work with integrity, prioritizing relationships over transactions. When Andrea gave birth to their daughter Sophia, followed by their son Ian, Rusty's sense of purpose deepened. In the suburban neighborhood of Dunwoody, the Sneidermans were viewed as the picture-perfect American family. They were kind, friendly, and actively involved in the community. The kind of neighbors everyone was glad to have. Rusty took pride in their home and the life he and Andrea had built together. He adored Andrea and fully supported her aspirations. When Andrea decided to rejoin the workforce after spending time at home with their children, Rusty stood by her wholeheartedly. He encouraged her to apply for a position at General Electric GE, where she became a project manager and reported directly to a senior executive named Hemi Newman. Andrea's new job required frequent travel, including conferences, business trips, and late-night meetings. Rusty willingly took on more parenting responsibilities and remained proud of her achievements, confident in their relationship. But over time, things began to change. Andrea's travel increased, and she appeared more distracted and distant. Rusty still tried to support her, but it was hard for him to ignore some of the signs, like the late-night phone calls, the vague explanations, and the change in her demeanor. Despite these red flags, Rusty remained silent. He trusted Andrea and believed in the life they had built. Unbeknownst to Rusty, Andrea's professional relationship with her boss, Hemi Newman, had crossed a line. Hemi had grown infatuated with her, and their work lives began to overlap with their personal ones. At the time, Rusty was focused on his children and career. To outsiders, the Sneidermans seemed like a stable, happy family. Behind closed doors, however, a dangerous dynamic was forming, one Rusty was entirely unaware of. The tragedy that followed didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with trust. Trust from a man who loved deeply, valued loyalty, and centered his life on family. Rusty had a thriving career, 2 beloved children, and a wife he deeply cherished. His life was full of meaning and joy, yet all of it would be snatched away in a devastating instant. The man responsible had already entered their lives. Hemi Newman wasn't someone who instantly raised red flags. On paper, he is an experienced, intelligent engineer who takes on a leadership role at General Electric Energy in Atlanta, where he manages more than 5,000 employees. Colleagues described him as intelligent, confident, and occasionally arrogant. But beneath his polished facade, Hemi was unraveling. Though married with 2 children, his personal life was far from stable. Outwardly, he seemed successful, but privately, he was grappling with unhappiness. His marriage was crumbling, financial stress was mounting, and he appeared emotionally lost. His wife began to suspect him when he became cold, irritable, and unapproachable. And then Andrea entered his life. Andrea Sneiderman stood out at GE from the beginning. She was attractive, confident, and articulate, a woman who excelled in meetings, traveled seamlessly, and carried herself with ease. She laughed freely and admired Hemi in a way that felt absent in his own marriage, and he became captivated by her. Initially, Hemi and Andrea's relationship was purely business. However, over time, it evolved. First subtly, then intensely. They spent countless hours collaborating on presentations, attending conferences, and often sharing meals or drinks at hotel bars after meetings. Their work travels took them to places like Lake Tahoe, Denver, London, and even Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. To those around them, their connection seemed far more personal than business-related. Andrea later denied having an affair. She claimed that Hemi's feelings were unrequited, that she only saw him as a friend, and any closeness was misinterpreted. However, Others have a different perspective. According to them, this relationship is emotional, flirtatious, and sometimes goes further, beyond work boundaries. Meanwhile, Rusty remained oblivious. Though aware of Andrea's frequent travel, he trusted her deeply. However, in the days leading up to his murder, Rusty grew uneasy. He noticed a suspicious man lingering near their home, a man wearing a hat, a fake mustache, and earmuffs. Alarmed by the man's presence, Rusty called 911. Rusty mentioned to the operator that he thought the man had a gun in his back pocket. His voice was steady but anxious, as he explained that he didn't know who the man was, but emphasized that he didn't want the man near his house. What Rusty couldn't know was that the stranger outside was Hemi, in disguise, preparing to kill him. 8 days later, Hemi followed Rusty to the Dunwoody Prep Daycare Center, where Hemi shot him at point-blank range in front of horrified parents and teachers. How did a successful and respected executive become a murderer? The answer reveals disturbing complexities. In police custody, Hemi confessed to the murder but claimed that he wasn't in control of his actions. He explained that he suffered from hallucinations and hearing voices. One voice, resembling Barry White, urged him to kill himself. Investigators were shocked. Hemi's calm demeanor during the interrogation added to their unease. Despite his claims of mental illness, he appeared composed, methodical, and even rehearsed. While admitting to the crime, he attempted to frame it as a result of psychological turmoil. Throughout the interrogation, one name kept surfacing: Andrea. Hemi told police that he was in love with her, believing they were soulmates. He described how she confided in him about her troubled marriage and how their emotional connection gave him hope for a future together. Andrea, however, denied any romantic involvement. She stated that Hemi had overstepped boundaries, making unwanted advances, which she had firmly rejected. She maintained that she only saw him as a colleague, but Hemi's phone records contradicted her claims. In the 6 months leading up to Rusty's murder, Andrea and Hemi exchanged more than 1,400 calls and text messages. Their emails suggested emotional, if not romantic, intimacy. In one such email, Hemi even proposed marriage. Andrea dismissed this as silly and inappropriate, testifying that she had told him to stop and made it clear his advances were unwelcome. Yet, she had allowed him into her hotel room during work trips, traveled alone with him, confided in him, arranged to pick him up from the airport, and even moved her seat on planes to sit beside him. She never mentioned any of this to Rusty. Hemi's wife, Ariella Newman, also felt that the relationship was not strictly professional. Ariella eventually filed for separation, but by then, it was too late. Hemi had already purchased the .40 caliber handgun that would ultimately end Rusty's life. A gun dealer later testified that Hemi had approached him, claiming he needed a firearm for home protection. After the murder, Hemi contacted the same dealer again, this time to ask about how to dispose of the gun for the police. It became evident that Hemi's obsession had taken a dark and deadly turn. As investigators assembled the case, one key question remained: was he acting alone? Did Andrea manipulate Hemi into murdering her husband? Did she feed his delusions, fuel his obsession, and make him believe that her husband Rusty was the only obstacle keeping them apart? Or was she an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos of a man spiraling out of control? Andrea had claimed she didn't know Rusty had been shot until she arrived at the hospital, around 11 a.m., but phone records showed she had called Rusty's father at 9:36 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the shooting, and told him that Rusty had been shot. How did she know no one had told her? Police hadn't released that information yet. Her own testimony contradicted what she had told Rusty's family. Rusty's father would later testify in court, visibly emotional, confirming that Andrea had called and said that Rusty had been shot and that she was heading to Dunwoody Prep to find out what had happened. If Andrea didn't know, why would she say that? Prosecutors were beginning to suspect that Andrea wasn't just a grieving widow. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Maybe she hadn't pulled the trigger. But had she played a part? As Hemi sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators uncovered more receipts, rental records, gun purchases. By January 2011, Hemi was charged with murder. But the question hanging over the case was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. The real question was who else knew. More than a year after the murder of Rusty Sneiderman, the case finally arrived in a courtroom. The DeKalb County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, legal observers, family members all watched as the man accused of gunning down a young father at a daycare center stood trial. Hemi had confessed to pulling the trigger. Now, he wasn't fighting to prove he was innocent. He was fighting to prove he was insane. At the center of the defense strategy was one claim: Hemi wasn't in his right mind when he murdered Rusty. He was mentally ill, lost in delusions, manipulated by voices, and incapable of knowing right from wrong. His lawyers entered a plea of not guilty due to insanity. The prosecution, however, contended the opposite. He was sane, calculated, and dangerously obsessed. This was not a breakdown. It was a betrayal fueled by infatuation and selfish desire. During opening statements, the courtroom heard a bizarre explanation that completely changed the way the trial was perceived. Hemi's lawyers said he had been hearing voices for weeks before the murder. One deep, masculine voice, like Barry White's, repeatedly encouraged him to kill himself. Meanwhile, another soft, gentle voice, like Olivia Newton-John, instructed him to kill Rusty, saying that Rusty was a danger to his children. Hemi claimed that he truly believed he was protecting the Rusty's children. The story was so bizarre that it seemed beyond belief. The jury was silent, and even seasoned reporters could not hide their disbelief. A psychiatrist testified that Hemi suffered from bipolar disorder with psychotic features and was experiencing a manic, delusional episode when he committed the crime. Another expert supported this diagnosis, stating that Hemi's grip on reality had been unraveling for months, but the prosecution rejected this narrative entirely. To them, the voices were a fabrication, a calculated act. They didn't see a man spiraling out of control. They saw someone meticulously planning a murder, renting a car under a false identity, donning a disguise, driving across town, waiting, shooting, leaving. All of it pointed to premeditation. The prosecution also highlighted how Hemi deceived those around him. To them, this wasn't about mental illness. It was about jealousy, rejection, and unfulfilled desire. They argued that the true motivation behind the murder wasn't insanity. It was Andrea. The tension in the courtroom peaked when Andrea took the stand. She appeared different from before, polished and distant. Some described her as composed, while others saw arrogance in her demeanor. Andrea was asked directly if she had ever been romantically involved with Hemi, and she replied that she had not. The prosecution was prepared for this response. They presented a series of emails filled with emotionally charged messages. In one, Hemi pleaded with her to marry him. Others described shared moments, stargazing, waking up together in Denver, and walking hand in hand in Edinburgh. Andrea denied any romantic involvement, claiming that he had been infatuated, that she had tried to handle it, and that she had never encouraged it. Her testimony, however, only raised more questions. She admitted to letting Hemi into her hotel room during work trips, but maintained it was always innocent. She also admitted she never told her husband, Rusty, about Hemi's advances. Even after realizing Hemi had feelings for her, she continued to travel with him, sit beside him on flights, and take his late-night calls. The boundary between professional and personal was hopelessly blurred. When questioned about why she hadn't disclosed the nature of her relationship with Hemi to the police, Andrea said she didn't think it was relevant. But that explanation didn't sit well, neither with the prosecution nor the jury. Suspicion deepened when Rusty's father testified that Andrea had called him less than 30 minutes after the shooting and said Rusty had been shot, a fact that hadn't yet been made public. Andrea had previously claimed she didn't know about the shooting until she arrived at the hospital. Her timeline didn't add up. The prosecution seized on this inconsistency. If Andrea knew about the shooting before anyone told her, how did she know? Did Hemi warn her in advance? Did she already know it was going to happen? These questions hung heavily in the courtroom, unsettling the jury. The murder case with signs of insanity initially seemed simple, but then it became much more complicated and confusing. The defense reminded the jury that this trial was not about Andrea. Hemi was the one facing a life sentence. They repeatedly focused on Hemi's troubled past, including an abusive father and years of emotional instability. The defense argued that while Andrea may have been emotionally careless, it was Hemi who ultimately lost control. The prosecution, however, was relentless. In their closing arguments, they portrayed Hemi not as psychotic, but as calculated. They ridiculed the suggestion that voices compelled Hemi to act, mocking the idea that hearing songs by Barry White and Olivia Newton-John could justify a premeditated murder. The jury swiftly arrived at a verdict after thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimony. Hemi Newman was declared guilty but mentally ill. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, guaranteeing he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. Andrea called the verdict a relief and described her late husband, Rusty, as an amazing man. Yet the trial had permanently altered how the public viewed her. The inconsistent testimony, coupled with her behavior and relationship with Hemi, her husband's killer, created a lingering suspicion that she could not shake. Justice came with complications. Hemi Newman would spend the rest of his life in prison, held responsible for killing Rusty Sneiderman while grappling with mental illness. For Rusty's family, the verdict brought some sense of closure, but true peace remained elusive. Andrea was never charged with murder. Although she was initially charged, prosecutors later dropped the most serious charges because there was not enough evidence to clearly and convincingly prove her involvement. Instead, she was convicted of perjury and obstruction for lying under oath and misleading investigators. She served time in prison, but not for her husband's death. The case left a lasting impact. A father was killed in cold blood outside his child's daycare. His murderer was consumed by an obsession with another man's wife, and Andrea, at the heart of it all, faced a lifetime of skepticism in the court of public opinion.